What is the difference between shading and saturation? Can you explain these two terms in more detail? I've watched your videos on the Fountain Pen 101 and you explain it, but I don't grasp it. Okay, so these two terms are not exactly in like the Webster's dictionary in terms of how it's used for fountain pens. It's not going to be very explicit about it, and there is some like generalization, and everybody's got kind of different interpretations of what it actually means. The terms are sometimes used interchangeably by some, so it can be a little confusing. I totally get it. I am not like the end-all be-all authority on it. I will just give you my best interpretation of it. Take it for what you will. So for me, saturation has purely to do with the formulation of the ink. The saturation has to do with how much dye is in the ink, because ink is dye and water and other various components, but that's what actually makes ink look different than just plain water. It's the dye. So if you have a little bit of dye in there, it is a low degree of saturation. If there's a lot of dye in there, it's highly saturated. Now, how do you actually measure that? We don't know how much dye is actually in there, and depending on what type of dye, the color and stuff, the saturation could be different in terms of its actual chemical formulation. But the end result that it will give you is how much shading do you get? So it's almost like shading is almost kind of a measurement that determines some of how saturated it really is. That's why it's so confusing, because the terms overlap a little bit. But with saturation, it's pretty much just the ink itself. That's about the only factor, is the ink really saturated or not? Certain manufacturers like Noodler's, Diamine, Private Reserve will tend to have more saturated dyes in their ink than some of the brands that come from pen manufacturers like Lamy, Schaefer, whoever. Pen companies tend to make lesser saturated inks because the more dye you have in your ink, the more you need to clean it out, the more potential clogging you could have if you don't clean your pen regularly, the drier it could be, or you need to counteract the dryness of the dye with more lubricant, which can cause more nib creep and things such as this. So pen makers tend to make their inks less saturated because it's just less, maintenance on the pens when you use less saturated inks, if that makes sense. More saturated inks, like these boutique ones that are not associated with pens. Noodler's is kind of different because they started making pens after they started making inks. So Noodler's is just kind of its own situation anyway. But the more saturated it is, the more it's going to pop. The darker, the more vibrant, whatever it's going to be when you put more dye in there. When you don't have a saturated ink, it's going to look kind of watery. Okay, so that might be kind of how you could determine if it looks kind of watery and washed out. It's not very heavily saturated. If it looks really punchy, really crisp, it is usually more saturated. Shading, on the other hand, has more to degree with the amount that the ink varies in terms of its color or lightness and darkness when you're actually writing with it on the paper. Shading is a little different because the paper can be a factor, the nib can be a factor. All of these things can come into play when it's shading. If you have a very absorbent paper, you're not going to get a lot of shading because that ink is just going to soak into the page and it's going to look very flat. If you have a very ink-resistant paper like the Triumph or like some of the finer papers, you're going to get more shading with the same pen and ink combination than you would on a more absorbent paper. So the ink is not as much a factor as it could be with the paper. That said, the nib selection that you have, if you're using a wetter nib or something like a stub or italic nib, you could see more shading than you would in an extra fine where it's not putting as much ink down on the page. So the nib type comes into play with the shading, and then of course the ink itself. How saturated the ink is will help to determine how much shading there is. The lesser the saturation in the ink, usually there's an inverse relationship. The less saturation you have, the less dye you have in the ink, usually the more variation you'll see, because where the ink pools up in certain parts of the letter, it will then in turn be more saturated with the dye because you'll be looking through more of the dye, you'll be seeing more of the ink, and it'll see more shading between the lighter and darker parts. I don't know if that helps to clear anything up. I tried to explain it as best I could. I took detailed notes and everything, but that's, I think, the best way that I can explain it. The saturation has to do just with the ink. the shading has to do with all these things coming together to give you that visual end result of the variation of light and darkness of the ink in your writing. Does that make sense? Hopefully.